The news did not arrive with fanfare or long speeches. It arrived quietly in the stillness of the morning. In Asia, the sun had just begun to rise. In New York and London, traders were sipping their coffee expecting another ordinary day. Then a single headline flashed across global news screens and the world stopped to read it. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in West Africa, had signed a $14 billion grain deal with India. 20 million tons of maize and sorghum would flow across borders and oceans for the next 10 years. For most people, it was unthinkable. How could a country that many had only associated with gold mines, cotton fields, or political struggles suddenly step onto the world stage as a grain giant? The first reaction was shock. Commodity markets shook. Prices in Chicago, Mumbai, and London jumped within minutes. Analysts rushed to television studios calling it historic, a game changer, a move that could shift the balance of global food security. In South America and Eastern Europe, exporters felt threatened. In Africa, neighbors looked on with wonder, asking themselves if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? But beyond the numbers, $14 billion, 20 million tons, 10 years, this was about something deeper. It was about identity, dignity, and sovereignty. For India, it was a shield against the uncertainty of monsoon rains. For Burkina Faso, it was a declaration that the nation could no longer be ignored, that its soil and its farmers mattered on the world stage. So the question is, was this just another trade deal, or was it the beginning of a new chapter in how Africa defines its future? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to recognize President Ibrahim Traoré's bold vision. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The story begins not in the corridors of power, but in the silence of fields stretching across the Sahel. For decades, Burkina Faso's farmers had tilled this land under a burning sun, producing maize and sorghum for local markets often overlooked by the world. Yet on one extraordinary morning, those same grains carried the weight of history. The announcement came with almost shocking simplicity, 3 short paragraphs, no slogans, no political fanfare. Burkina Faso had agreed to supply India with 20 million metric tons of grain over the next decade, valued at $14 billion. It was the largest agricultural deal in the nation's history. For India, a country of 1.4 billion people, this was more than a purchase. It was insurance. Its food system has always depended on the unpredictable rhythm of the monsoon. A season of heavy rains could produce mountains of grain only for much of it to rot in warehouses. A weak monsoon could leave shelves empty, forcing sudden imports at painful prices. India needed a safety net. Burkina Faso offered one. For Burkina Faso, this was recognition. Until now, the nation's global identity had been tied to gold mines and cotton fields and to its political instability. Few had imagined it could step forward as an agricultural power. Yet, here it was, with a deal large enough to shift global markets. The shockwaves were immediate. Within minutes of the news breaking, grain prices surged. Traders in Mumbai, Chicago, and London scrambled to adjust futures contracts. Television networks rushed agricultural analysts into their studios. Some called the deal historic. Others labeled it a game changer for global food security. Rival exporters in South America and Eastern Europe were particularly alarmed. Argentina, Brazil, and Ukraine had long dominated the Asian grain market. Now, out of nowhere, Burkina Faso had claimed a share. Analysts began to warn of future price wars of exporters undercutting each other to hold onto their contracts. And yet what gave the announcement such force was not its drama, but its plainness. No fiery speeches. No exaggerated promises. Just numbers: 20 million tons. $14 billion. 10 years. Sometimes the simplest words shake the foundations of power. Behind the scenes, this deal had been years in the making. 3 years earlier, Burkina Faso's leaders had quietly begun attending international trade and food security forums. They did not arrive with grand advertising campaigns or lofty promises. They came with careful words. Our land has potential. Our farmers have capacity. Our soil is ready. Indian officials listened. They knew their country could no longer rely solely on domestic harvests or on the same foreign suppliers. Climate change was making weather patterns less predictable, and political instability in other regions carried risks. To depend on just 1 or 2 sources for grain was dangerous. Diversification was survival, but trust had to be built. Indian envoys traveled to Burkina Faso's Central Plains. They walked among the fields, examined silos, and spoke with farmers. They asked the difficult questions: could Burkina Faso harvest enough grain? Was the quality consistent? Could supply be guaranteed for a full decade? Step-by-step confidence grew. There was one enormous obstacle: Burkina Faso is landlocked. To deliver millions of tons of grain to Indian ports, crops would have to cross multiple borders, move through neighboring countries, and be stored in coastal facilities before ever reaching the ocean. At first, many doubted whether this was possible, but here the partnership deepened. India and Burkina Faso agreed to co-invest in infrastructure. Roads were improved, railways upgraded, port storage expanded. What began as a logistical nightmare became a symbol of cooperation. The solution itself was proof this was not merely a deal on paper, but a long-term commitment to building capacity. And so the $14 billion announcement was not just about grain. It was about the possibility that a small, landlocked African country could become indispensable to the global food system. It was about showing the world that Africa was not a passive player, but a strategic actor. For Burkina Faso, the deal was a declaration: we are no longer only defined by our struggles, we can feed the world. The calm of that morning did not last. Within hours of the announcement, the world's markets erupted. Screens on trading floors flickered red and green as grain futures jumped higher. In Mumbai, brokers abandoned their coffee cups, rushing to phones and terminals. In Chicago, traders shouted across the pit, recalculating contracts. London analysts spoke breathlessly of a tremor in the global food system. This was the moment of climax, when a quiet declaration from Ouagadougou shook the centers of global finance. For decades, the grain trade had been a predictable story. South America, Argentina, and Brazil supplied Asia with maize and soy. Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, had carved its share. Africa was rarely mentioned, Burkina Faso least of all. Yet now, one of the continent's smallest landlocked nations had broken through the glass ceiling. The ripple was not only economic, it was political. In Brasilia and Buenos Aires, agricultural lobbies demanded answers from their governments. How had they lost ground to a country most of their citizens could not even place on a map? In Kyiv, struggling under the weight of war, Ukraine's grain exporters saw the deal as a painful reminder that markets would not wait for peace. In neighboring West Africa, however, the mood was electric. From Senegal to Ghana, newspapers asked the same question: if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? Radio callers spoke with pride of an African country commanding headlines, not for conflict, but for commerce. It was a psychological breakthrough, the sense that Africa's soil could command respect, that its farmers could influence the price of bread in New Delhi. India, too, felt the impact at home. The government hailed the deal as a masterstroke of foresight. By securing long-term grain supplies, it reassured its people that the specter of food shortages could be pushed back. For ordinary Indian families, it meant something deeper: the possibility of affordable food, even in years when the monsoon failed. But perhaps the most surprising reaction came from financial commentators. Many had dismissed Burkina Faso as too unstable, too poor, too far inland to ever manage such an enterprise. Yet the deal's design: joint investments in railways, silos, and port facilities showed sophistication. This was not charity. This was not dependency. It was partnership by choice. That choice rattled old powers. In Washington and Brussels, policymakers watched carefully. For years, Western nations had spoken of helping Africa feed itself while still treating the continent largely as a market to sell into. Now, an African nation had positioned itself as a provider, not just a consumer. The implications were unsettling. The high drama played out on television screens. Agricultural experts compared rainfall maps of West Africa and India, explaining how different climate cycles gave the deal its strength. Pundits in London warned of a possible grain price war as South American suppliers fought to defend their market share. Environmental advocates noted with interest that by diversifying across continents, India had quietly created one of the first global food security models resilient to climate change. In Ouagadougou itself, the response was more emotional. Crowds gathered in marketplaces talking about the future in tones of pride. For once, the global news cycle was not about coups, poverty, or terrorism. It was about Burkina Faso taking its place among nations shaping the world economy. Still, concerns lingered. Critics inside the country asked, would so much grain leaving the nation create shortages at home? Would the poorest be left behind while ships carried food abroad? The government, aware of these fears, promised safeguards reserves set aside for domestic consumption subsidies, funded by the deal's revenues, new irrigation projects to raise yields. Whether these would be enough remained to be seen, but the commitment was clear. This was not just export for profit, but a gamble for national growth. At the heart of it all was a paradox. The deal was announced with calm simplicity, yet its impact was anything but quiet. It roared across markets, rattled rivals, emboldened neighbors, and redefined what an African nation could be in the 21st century. The climax was unmistakable. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a footnote in global trade, had forced the world to pay attention. For every triumph on the global stage, there is an echo at home. In Burkina Faso, the $14 billion grain deal was no exception. Markets abroad celebrated soaring contracts, but inside the country, ordinary families asked a simple, urgent question: will there still be food on our own tables? This was not a rhetorical fear. History across Africa had taught painful lessons: countries exporting cash crops while their own people went hungry. The government in Ouagadougou understood this risk. Almost immediately, officials announced that a fixed share of national grain production would be reserved for domestic use. No matter how high international prices climbed, that quota could never be exported. For families in villages and towns, this pledge offered reassurance, but reassurance alone would not be enough. To prove its sincerity, the government linked revenue from the deal directly to food subsidies and irrigation projects. It promised new reservoirs, canals, and pumps to ensure that farmers could produce more, not less, even as millions of tons left for India. On the political front, the deal was transformative. For years, Burkina Faso's leaders had been dismissed by critics as managers of crisis rather than builders of opportunity. Now, under the banner of this agreement, they claimed a different identity: architects of sovereignty. The contract with India was presented not merely as trade, but as a rebuke to the old order, a demonstration that the nation could negotiate on equal terms with a global giant. Opposition voices, however, remained skeptical. Some warned of overdependence on a single buyer. What would happen if India's politics shifted, or if global prices collapsed? Would Burkina Faso's entire agricultural strategy be hostage to forces beyond its control? Others pointed to corruption risks. $14 billion is a fortune in any economy. Would those funds truly reach farmers, or would they vanish into the pockets of elites? These doubts carried weight, yet they also fueled a larger debate about governance, accountability, and the direction of the nation. Civil society groups, unions, and student associations began pressing for greater transparency, demanding published reports on grain reserves, infrastructure spending, and the distribution of subsidies. In this sense, the deal not only reshaped the economy, it revitalized political discourse at home. For the farmers themselves, the consequences were immediate and deeply personal. Many who had struggled with outdated tools now saw the promise of modern irrigation systems, storage silos, and access to training funded by the partnership. A sorghum farmer in the Central Plains might suddenly find his harvest stored safely instead of rotting in the open air. A young villager could be employed in the construction of new roads, linking farms to ports in neighboring countries. The agreement was not only about exports, it was about weaving agriculture into the broader fabric of national development. Yet, the psychological impact may have been the most profound. For decades, Burkina Faso's youth had been told their future lay abroad, migrating for work, escaping poverty. The grain deal sent a different message: that their land, their labor, and their homeland mattered. Pride surged. For once, international news was not about coups or crises, but about a small West African nation dictating terms on the global stage. Still, the stakes remain high. If the government succeeds balancing exports with domestic security, channeling revenue into real development, it will have created a model for all of Africa. But if it fails, if shortages appear, if corruption spreads, the backlash could be fierce, and the promise of sovereignty might unravel. In the end, the civil and political consequences of the deal are inseparable. Burkina Faso is no longer just trading grain. It is trading in legitimacy, in pride, and in the fragile trust of its people. When news of the Burkina Faso-India grain deal reached the West, it was met with a mix of surprise, admiration, and unease. In Washington, policymakers studied the details carefully. The United States had long viewed global food systems through the lens of stability. For decades, American grain dominated exports to Asia. Now the stage was shifting, and an African country was rewriting the rules. American analysts quickly recognized what this meant. Africa was no longer just a recipient of aid, it was becoming a supplier of security. The image of a landlocked West African nation guaranteeing food stability for 1.4 billion Indians ran counter to old assumptions about dependence. For U.S. observers, it raised uncomfortable questions. If Burkina Faso could rise as a grain power, what might happen if other African nations followed? Could the 21st century truly become the century of Africa, not as a slogan, but as a material fact? In Europe, the reaction was no less tense. Brussels had spent years promoting trade partnerships in Africa, often wrapped in conditions political reforms, human rights clauses, or military cooperation. By contrast, India's approach appeared refreshingly simple grain for investment, equality for respect. The fact that Burkina Faso chose India over traditional Western buyers was interpreted by many European commentators as a rejection of the old order. It was a reminder that African nations could chart their own course, not bound to the former colonial powers. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the deal was studied with curiosity. China had built an extensive presence across Africa, investing heavily in infrastructure and agriculture. Yet here was India stepping into the same arena with a major success. To Chinese strategists, it signaled a new layer of competition for influence in Africa, one that could reshape alliances and trading patterns across the continent. But perhaps the most important shift was not in policy circles, but in the realm of perception. Around the world, headlines declared Burkina Faso an emerging agricultural hub. For ordinary readers in America, accustomed to seeing Africa framed in crisis, famine, conflict, instability, the story felt different. It was a narrative of pride, competence, and vision. Still in U.S., think tanks debate stirred. Some argued the deal was a warning that the West must engage Africa more seriously, or risk being sidelined in a region rich with resources and talent. Others were skeptical, questioning whether Burkina Faso could sustain production, whether logistics would hold, and whether corruption might undermine the promise. Yet, even the skeptics admitted one fact: the deal had changed the conversation. For African diaspora communities in the U.S., the announcement carried special resonance. Churches in New York, community halls in Atlanta, and radio stations in Chicago buzzed with the story. It was not just about food, it was about dignity. Listeners said it felt like a rebuttal to centuries of stereotypes. A land once dismissed as poor and powerless had just secured a contract that shook global markets. On a deeper level, the Burkina Faso-India partnership highlighted a truth long ignored in the West: that global stability is no longer dictated solely from Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. A landlocked African nation once overlooked had shown it could shape the prices of bread, livestock feed, and even milk across continents. For America, the challenge is clear. Will it adapt to this new reality, recognizing Africa as a partner in shaping global security, or cling to outdated perceptions of dependency? The answer will shape not only U.S. relations with Africa, but the future of world order itself. History often turns not with a roar, but with a whisper. What began as a quiet 3-paragraph announcement has now grown into a storm reshaping markets, politics, and perceptions across the globe. Burkina Faso, once spoken of only in the context of gold mines and instability, has declared itself a player in global food security. India, once content to rely on its own vast fields, has looked across oceans to secure its future. Together they have written a new chapter. But every opportunity carries risk. If managed well, this $14 billion deal could transform Burkina Faso into a model of agricultural sovereignty, inspiring other African nations to follow. If mishandled, it could expose the nation to shortages, corruption, or political backlash. Success will depend not only on exports, but on whether ordinary families can feel the benefits in cheaper food, in better roads, in schools built from grain revenues. For the world, the warning is clear. Dependence on a handful of exporters is dangerous. Climate change, conflict, and economic shocks can disrupt supply overnight. The Burkina Faso-India partnership shows that diversification is not only wise, it is necessary. Even a landlocked nation often overlooked can hold the key to stability for billions. For the United States and Europe, the lesson is sobering. Africa is no longer content to be a passive recipient of aid or charity. It is stepping forward as a provider, a partner, a force. Those who fail to recognize this shift will be left behind, clinging to outdated maps of power while the ground moves beneath them. And so the question now rests with us. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's bold strategies are truly working? Or is this only the first test of a fragile dream? Can Africa's rise through dignity and sovereignty reshape a world order built for others, not for itself? And for us watching from afar, can we learn to see Africa not as a burden, but as a cornerstone of our shared future? If you feel you are among the first to witness and support this transformation, please share this video. And if you believe like us that the truth is more important than the headlines, subscribe and stay with us as history unfolds before our eyes.